So, today on the podcast, we have one of our book episodes. Recently, film and art critic Karen Fang published a biography on Disney concept artist Tyrus Wong called Background Artist. And you may be familiar with Tyrus Wong. In 2015, director Pam Tom created a feature-length documentary on the work of Tyrus, which was presented on PBS as part of the American Masters series. But now Karen Fang has published a detailed biography that further explores Tyrus's life and work. Tyrus had a long career as an artist, working for Warner Brothers and Disney and creating his own work. But in Disney circles, Tyrus is mainly remembered for his concept work on Bambi, which then stylized the film's environment. In discussions of pop culture, sometimes there is a sense of a Disney house style, and there is some partial truth to a Disney house style. For example, many of the short cartoons from the 1930s, 40s, and the early 50s share a recognizable visual presentation. Also, many of the animated features from the early 1950s share stylistic elements, particularly in character design. For example, in Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, and Peter Pan, the main human characters mostly slant toward a type of illustrative realism, and the secondary comic characters and villains often slant toward caricature. But in the 1930s and early 1940s, Walt developed features so that each of them would have its own unique visual style, one specifically arranged to engage that story's themes. The European storybook qualities of Snow White are very different than the comedic visual exaggeration of Dumbo, which then are different from the minimalistic and flowing visual qualities of Bambi. Maybe look at it this way. The misty and soft backgrounds in Bambi suggest a forest more than they offer a detailed representation of it. The environment in Bambi includes open spaces and graceful shapes. In terms of a color palette, it offers subtle tonal shifts in color, which is very different than the style for Dumbo, which uses strong color contrast to define many scenes as places of high energy. In Bambi's color arrangement, the shape selections, and the spare use of detail, its environmental design is clearly influenced by the traditions of Chinese painting and also by the elegant and purposeful brushstrokes of calligraphy. And these here are some of the qualities that Tyrus Wong brought to this project, giving Bambi's environment a look and feel that is different than other animated features made during Walt's lifetime. As I alluded to earlier, Tyrus Wong, over the course of a long career, was not primarily an artist for animation. He only worked at Disney for 3 years. He started as an in-betweener, but then moved over to Bambi, where he helped shape the visual style for the entire picture. Like many other Disney artists, Tyrus was laid off after the devastating strike of 1941. He left with hundreds of other Disney employees during this period. The layoffs here in part stemmed from the challenging economics of American film production as war raged across Europe. Because key film markets overseas were closed, Disney features, despite high production values, repeatedly underperformed at the box office and left the studio in debt to Bank of America. Bank of America then insisted that Disney put no new traditional animated features into production until overseas markets recovered and animated features might again have a sure path toward profit. The demands of Bank of America in part led to a series of layoffs at the studio, which also included Tyrus. Bambi in this mix has an unusual history in the terms of Disney features. Bambi was being developed during the final years that Disney was at the relatively small studio space on Hyperion Avenue in the Silver Lake neighborhood of Los Angeles. a studio that had been initially established in 1926 to make short cartoons. As Walt shifted toward feature production, he built new buildings, bought or rented nearby houses and apartment complexes to make additional production space. But the available space wasn't large enough for the dreams that he had at that time, specifically to develop multiple animated features with an eye toward releasing perhaps 2 a year. This along with the production of many short cartoons. For a while, Walt set up a temporary second studio on Seward Street in Hollywood, using space once occupied by another early animation studio, the Harmon Ising Studio. This space had been developed and used by Hugh Harmon and Rudy Ising, who had worked with Walt both in Kansas City and in Los Angeles before striking out on their own. The Seward Street location was about 5 miles from the Disney complex on Hyperion Avenue. Walt's ultimate plan was to unify all of his artists, both from the Seward Street operation and from the main studio on Hyperion, when he moved his business over to a newly developed and very large studio complex then being built in Burbank. But for much of Tyrus's time at Disney, he was at that smaller offshoot location on Seward Street, while Walt kept his office at the Hyperion studio. Walt did go over to Seward Street for story meetings and to check development on Bambi, but this is one of the underlying reasons that Tyrus, though central to the development of Bambi, never really entered Walt's circle as did other artists doing concept work during this time. There are some other issues here, but right now, I'm just trying to set the stage. In her deeply researched book, Karen Fang presents Tyrus's life from a young immigrant to his time as an art student at the Otis Art Institute to his time at Disney, then Warner Brothers, and then to becoming a fairly famous Christmas card artist, similar to Disney artist Ivan Earle. But in our episode today, we'll mostly focus on both his early life and influences and also his time at Disney. And that there is our episode for today. By now, I think our unique review format is familiar to regular listeners. I'll read a section from the book so you can get a sense of how the author puts together the life story of Tyrus Wong through language, the flow of the biography, and the movement of the story, and then we'll have a conversation with the author, mostly about Tyrus and his work at Disney and how his personal vision for art gave Bambi a unique visual presentation on the screen. And so now, if you're ready, let's go. To start out today, I'll read a short section from Karen Fang's book, Background Artist. The section I'll read comes from a chapter called Man of the Forest, which is about a third of the way into the biography. In the material that I'll cover, Tyrus would be about 29 years old, give or take a little bit. And in terms of the studio, though Bambi had initially been selected as the second Disney feature after Snow White, the production team was having difficulty developing animal designs that were both engaging for animation and realistic, and they were also having trouble developing a design strategy for the forest in which Bambi lived. Bambi would eventually be reslotted as the 5th full-length animated feature produced by Disney. At the time this passage takes place, Tyrus was an entry-level animator, an in-betweener, but his real skill wasn't with a pencil, it was with a brush. As such, he developed some environmental paintings for Bambi at home, images that might be inspirational in planning out the production. And here's the section from Karen Fang's book. Yet, despite these advances and investments, Bambi remained stalled. The team of skilled artists that Walt had recruited from all over the nation and the globe could now draw better animals, but the creatures were getting lost in the countless leaves and branches of the story's woodland setting. Leading European artists Albert Herder, Gustav Tengren, and Ferdinand Hovarth all worked in a precious, highly wrought Arthur Rackham style, perfect for Snow White's fairy tale setting, but what worked in Snow White wasn't right for Bambi. And Walt could tell that Sultan's naturalistic tale required something beyond the existing stable of artists. The current Disney artist literally couldn't see the forest for the trees. "Well, I guess we put you in the wrong department," Disney layout artist Tom Kodrick said, with chagrin when Tyrus showed him the sample backgrounds he worked up on his own at home. The sample images were stunning in their beauty and the elegant simplicity with which they resolved the problem that had been hampering Bambi to date. In the real world, animals' ability to camouflage themselves in nature is an advantage, but visual storytelling requires the Bambi characters to stand out. Tyrus's sample images served that purpose by providing enough atmosphere to convey the mood and setting while still enabling the arduously developed animal characters to hold center stage. Walt, with his characteristically acute instinct for images with mass appeal, described it as innovation by negation. That infinite effect in the background, Walt said, was effective, better than a bunch of junk behind them. Mark Davis put it more evocatively. You felt the dampness and the moisture of everything in the forest, but you didn't draw every single leaf. Tyrus had gotten the idea to make his own samples once he heard studio gossip about the faltering Bambi project. His love of song painting and his own personal style helped him see the problem as an issue of landscape. Just as he had first taught himself Chinese aesthetics while in art school, Tyrus turned to the Los Angeles Public Library to borrow a copy of Sultan's book. Gee, he thought with surprise once he'd read through the novel, the whole thing is outdoors. Tyrus wasn't in the room when the mogul saw his sample boards, but that first glance over Tyrus's landscapes was evidence enough for Walt. Right away, he ordered that these designs set the tone for Bambi, and that all Bambi artists follow this artist's style. As suddenly and dramatically as his life had been changed when he won his Otis Scholarship, Tyrus was plucked from in-betweening and reassigned to Walt's pet project. Tyrus's Bambi work was as varied and interesting as in-betweening had been monotonous and boring. Told simply to continue developing concept art from which other artists and animators could develop the actual story sequences, Tyrus spent his time translating Sultan's words into visual images. On any given day, his work might entail depicting an oak tree after an ice storm, cobwebs on the grass, spiderwebs covered with dew, morning and evening showing shafts of light coming through deep woods, effect of wind on trees before thunderstorm. The requests and instructions came to him from internal memos by the animators and studio storymen who were in charge of adapting the novel into a screenplay. Tyrus could also draw from his own reading of the novel itself, which is notably less romanticized in its depiction of nature than the sanitized, family-friendly Disney version best known today. One scene that Tyrus invested considerable thought in was a recurring motif in the novel, in which two leaves on a tree branch wax philosophical over the meaning of life. Tyrus sketched the pair in fragile sap green, showing the young buds unfurling in spring. He painted them nestled among a crowd of other leaves in the flush foliage of summer. For their final scene, as the two age, dry leaves teeter on their withered stems, Tyrus turned to toned paper and relatively neutral pastel to express the resignation and sadness of the two longtime companions, as life fades and they face their inevitable separation. Ironically, the capriciousness of fate that the two leaves portray was realized when the passage never made it into Bambi's final cut. Perhaps Walt thought the passage too esoteric for the universal audience he sought, or redundantly sad given the climactic tragedy of Bambi's mother's death. Another cut passage that Tyrus forever remembered featured a mouse walking in the morning and tipping a nearby leaf for a dewdrop to wash his face. "I almost take that scene for my Christmas cards," he told an interviewer years later while acting out the scene. Perhaps caution regarding Disney's intellectual property kept Tyrus from imitating that scene outright. However, in a Christmas card image he designed for 1955, Tyrus all but recreates the same scene by replacing the mouse with a tiny elf perched on a mushroom, who reaches up to catch a glistening drop of dew. Of the hundreds of greeting cards he designed over his long career, this Disney-esque vignette seems to have had the most meaning for him. For years, Tyrus kept the original art for this card in his and Ruth's bedroom, where it still hung at the time of his death. Whatever the reason for these story sequences being cut from Bambi, such a sudden deviation in course couldn't have been surprising for Tyrus, an immigrant scholarship student and recent WPA trainee, already experienced in the sudden detours that life can bring. They are also typical of commercial art's arbitrary and non-autonomous nature, in which work-for-hire artists may enjoy decent income and more steady employment than those dependent on the vicissitude of fine art sales, but do so in the service of someone else's vision or brand. Pragmatic, glass-half-full Tyrus, however, chose to focus on the WPA-like fun of constant creative production. "I did hundreds of sketches," Tyrus recalled, in watercolor, pastel, charcoal, pencil, everything, every medium, any way. Tom Kodrick, who brought Tyrus's art before Walt, reassured him that, as long as Walt likes your work, he was fine. Tyrus's Otis classmate, Mark Davis, was always ready with some words of encouragement, girding him on the rare occasion when Tyrus faltered, with an enthusiastic, "You can do it, Ty." As he had at Otis, Tyrus also made new friends and influenced peers at Disney. Soon one of his closest friends was Travis Johnson, another story artist close to Tyrus's age, whom Tyrus noticed draws exactly like me. Tyrus probably was also the person who taught fellow sketch artist Sylvia Holland to draw with light pastels on dark-toned paper, which she would later use to great effect for the nighttime Nutcracker Suite portion Holland did for Fantasia. As a sign of Walt's favor and the ambition he held for Bambi, even as its production stretched on, the Bambi team enjoyed the freedom of being physically independent from general studio operations. During his brief stint as an in-betweener, Tyrus clocked in at the main Disney offices on Hyperion Avenue in Silver Lake, where Snow White was made. To nurture and protect his pet project, however, Walt moved the Bambi artists to separate offices on Seward Street in Hollywood. To keep them on track, day-by-day operations at Seward Street were overseen by Perce Pierce, a pipe-smoking impresario and the best gag stealer one ever saw, whom Walt liked for his ability to dramatize story ideas. Pierce, who later voiced Bambi's busy mole, saw his charge as that of a benevolent sentinel who tolerates playfulness while nurturing young talent. "Man is in the forest," Pierce would hoot whenever he saw Walt heading toward their offices for one of the boss's frequent surprise inspections. In this sly appropriation of what would become Bambi's most famous line, Pierce warned his colleagues to stop their hijinks and look busy. Thank you so much for joining us today here on the podcast. I very much appreciate that. And
I'm thrilled to be here. Yeah, I'm thrilled to have you here. So I have some questions about you and your fabulous book on Tyrus Wong. The first couple of questions are more about you and your interests. So, what got you interested initially in the world of film and art?
I'm a child of the 80s, and so I grew up with Spielberg and Lucas and VCRs and So I mean, I think that back then when we didn't have all the other distractions and the different kinds of delivery systems of images now, like the movies that you used to go and see with your friends, in the theater or that you watch on replay, at home on your TV, like those were like the collective stories that we all were captivated by. And of course, if you grew, in that era, I think we're about the same age, right? We're also like we had camcorders, and so it was like the first moment that filmmaking and story, became sort of accessible to the average person, right? The sort of barriers of entry were starting to fall. Of course, now anybody can make a movie with their phone, but with this little device in their pocket. But back then, like that was a paradigm shift, right? To make these, that you could imagine that somebody that's the person who behind E.T. or behind Star Wars was, somebody who grew up watching movies, and then suddenly these capabilities were available to us as well. So you couldn't have grown up in that era and not sort of like feel the power of cinema as a sort of like prevailing art form at the time.
I missed that world because cinema was one of the things that connected us because
Yeah,
there was like two or three new movies every Friday at most.
yeah,
And, depending on kind of like your age group, one of them was for you.
yeah.
And that was the thing to watch that week or for those 2 weeks. And most everyone saw that either on tape or at the cinema. And now the things that connect us visually in terms of cinema are just so few and far between. Everyone has their own little isolated individual worlds. So how did you become interested and aware of Tyrus's work?
So I think like everybody, just couldn't get away from him when he passed at the very end of 2016 because he died at 106 and there was so much coverage of him. And it was just really hard to miss this incredible story of, this Chinese immigrant who had survived really terrible circumstances, his month-long detention as a child at Angel Island, and then goes on to play this absolutely instrumental role in the making of this film that's, central to everyone's childhood. Like everyone, I was fascinated by his story. I had seen Pamela Tom's documentary that had come out the year before. But then, of course, as a film scholar and as an Asian American, I had realized I'd been running across his name a lot in the sort of, Asians in Hollywood sort of recovery work that was happening at that time. And then, animation is so important now, more important now than ever before. I just really like, I think a lot of people like wanted to dive into his story even more. And then once you get into it and you realize it's not just Bambi, but it was also at Warner Brothers for nearly 30 years, that he was a practicing and accomplished fine artist before the Hollywood work. That to me, what was one of the most interesting things was that he was one of the nation's leading Christmas card artists, right? And so to tell this story was something that I really, or I mean, even just sort of intellectually to understand what is this sort of unifying theme of an artist who can work in so many different media and whose hand shaped American visual culture in so many different forms.
You mentioned the Christmas cards. I was aware of Tyrus's inspirational work on Bambi or concept art for Bambi.
Yeah.
But then when I saw some of his Christmas cards years ago, I was like, oh yeah, I remember I remember my grandmother sending
Yeah,
those out.
exactly. No,
I've seen that
that
one with
was,
the bird before.
I think especially for those of us who grew up on the West Coast in that time,
Hmm.
like you may not, of course, the people who were buying and receiving those cards at the time, the adults, like they actually, it was quite intentional. And as you know
Hmm.
from the book, like, he had these fans who would seek him out, wrote fan letters, were all, waiting every year for the next collection to come out. But yeah, I mean, again, I had the same experience. It was like realizing like, oh, my parents got these cards too. So.
So one of the things that I really like about your book is how it uses Tyrus's life story as the starting point to talk about some larger cultural issues. And so for our listeners, I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about the Exclusion Act and how it affected Chinese immigrants and how maybe it also shaped Tyrus and perhaps even some of his art.
So the Chinese Exclusion Act was a federal policy that was in place from 1882 until 1943, so 60 years. And it was essentially an anti-immigration act, which was designed to sort of systematically prohibit or discourage the immigration of ethnic Asians into the United States. And this was in reaction to the thousands of Chinese who had come in the middle of the 19th century to work on the railroads. And that immigration had ironically been actively sort of recruited by the industrialists who were building the railroads. But then, of course, once the railroads are complete, there was a lot of anxiety among white and African American laborers in the United States who felt that the competition from the Chinese laborers was bringing down wages. There was sort of like larger sort of cultural anxieties about sort of the ability of Chinese and other ethnic Asians to assimilate. Can they really be Americans in the way that, however, somebody was defining American? By 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act sets very strict limits on the kinds of ethnic Asians who are allowed to enter the U.S. They're very limited in classes. You would have to be a merchant class, a religious worker, or a student. And then the laborers who were already there, or anybody else who entered after that time, they would have to constantly file papers to show that they were allowed to be in there. And then once they were here, they had very few civil rights, so they couldn't rent or own property. They were restricted to live in certain parts of town. They were restricted to certain jobs. If they were often required to pay fees or licenses to conduct their jobs that were not imposed on other races. They couldn't vote. They were subject to the anti-miscegenation law, so they couldn't marry outside of their race. The Chinese Exclusion Act was designed to discourage Chinese immigration and effectively to marginalize them, ethnic Asians in U.S. society.
And this is all part of Tyrus's early years when he arrives.
He spent his early years when he first arrived in the U.S. as a young man, as a boy, really, from about 10 to 14. He's living in Sacramento. And of course, each time he's living in a Chinatown, so he's living in like the Chinese district, or essentially like a ghetto.
So in your book, you talk about his personal aesthetic being a combination of Chinese and Western influences, particularly in terms of calligraphy. How would you describe his style? So on the podcast, we've been talking about Mary Blair for about the past year. And so we've been talking about the California scene movement and what Lee and Mary Blair are doing with watercolors that slant towards realism. And this is pretty much the same time that Tyrus is going to Otis. So could you talk a little bit about what his aesthetic is like and how it's maybe different than what's happening in California at the time?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I love that you immediately saw the sort of connections between his sort of heritage aesthetic and then his sort of trained aesthetic and the sort of synergy that's happening because in California, to define Tyrus's style. And this is like, this goes back to my original point about like what drew me to Tyrus's story is like this question of like, is there a unifying style through all of these different media and practices? Is that it's brushwork. Right, that Tyrus is fundamentally a painter, and that this kind of gestural, expressive style that's more evocative rather than interested in like the sort of precision, and that the line is calligraphic rather than architectural. Bambi's the one that people most know, and you can see it in the way that the background sort of create famously that sort of mood of the forest, right? But if you've seen his production designs at Warner Brothers, right, he's still doing this sort of brushwork style. It's very expressionistic, right, where he's able to convey the mood of like whatever scene that he's running, like a Western or an action sequence or like a noir film. He's using the play of shadow and light and very quick virtuoso line to convey feeling and emotion. And I think, Tyrus, for him, he had, his first form of aesthetic production that he learned was through Chinese calligraphy, which his father taught him. So even before he won his scholarship to go to Otis as a teenager. And at Otis, of course, he is going to get this sort of very traditional sort of atelier training in Western art history and media, and in where he's working in pastel and pencil, and he's doing fine print engravings. He uses oil. What you see over and over again is this sort of expressionistic style. And of course, at Otis, he meets Preston Blair, right, who is the brother of Lee Blair.
Yeah.
and Lee Blair is such an accomplished watercolorist. And so in Southern California at the time and throughout California, right, you have this sort of California watercolor movement, which is starting to work really big. It sees watercolor as a medium that's uniquely equipped to sort of capture the distinctiveness of California landscape and light. And so there's this really interesting thing that happens in California where the watercolor is sort of ennobled because in the European art tradition, like it's oil painting, it's big canvases, it's history painting or something like that. And in the early part of the 20th century in California, you get these watercolorists who are also sort of really celebrating the expressionistic quality of watercolor. And so for Tyrus, this is one of the reasons why when he goes to Otis, he's immediately recognized by his peers at the school as being this uniquely gifted painter because already in California, there's among the California watercolorists, this sort of receptiveness to vision and innovation and talent in watercolor or brushwork in general.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that actually confuses me a little bit about Tyrus's life. So in the 1930s, many of the other people that are art school trained and that are younger that come into the Disney studio that will work as concept artists, they don't come in the same way that Tyrus does. John Hench comes in as a layout artist. Lee Blair comes in as a colorist. Mary Blair comes in as kind of a colorist and then shifts over to a concept artist. He comes in through the in-between training program. So he's not working with a brush, he's working with a pencil.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how this came about because of the concept artists that are key for this time, I think he's the only one that comes into the studio this way.
You say, did Mary Bear, what Mary was first hired in what department?
So she works at two other animation studios before.
Oh, okay.
And then so she has some training, but these are all painters and they tend to take on different roles in the animation studios than do people that are more familiar with, say, life drawing.
Yeah.
And Tyrus makes this leap from his brushwork, which I think defines most of his art at Otis and his personal art at this time, to maybe being a little bit frustrated working with a pencil and working on a light board all day long.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, of course, he would never have called it a leap. He would have called it probably like an abasement, right? Because it's exactly right. It's lesser that for him, right? I mean, here he was, he had been one of Otis's like most decorated students upon graduation. And, he's already in the pages of the LA Times for his fine art work. And then to sort of, like you're saying, be entered into the, join the Disney Studios as an in-betweener, in some ways, it seems like a step down for him, right? He was like so many of the artists who were hired in the rush of the hiring rush right after Snow White. That was what the studio was doing, was putting everybody through in-betweening, right? As a sort of trial to figure out what people could do and hence who was worth keeping, right? So I think the studio is constantly learning more about itself through Snow White and after Snow White. And so I think, Tyrus, because he's hired at that moment, just sort of is ushered in, like so many others, into that trial thing, because that's a studio's way of sort of figuring out where to classify these artists, right? And then, but of course, Tyrus is able then subsequently to make his intentional leap because he realizes in-betweening is not for him. Although he's stuck in in-betweening, he has a number of people that he knows from Otis already in higher places at Disney, which is probably how he was able to get his sample art, in front of Walt. And so it's, upon that moment where he's able to move forward.
Let's talk about that for a little bit, like concept design. So in Bambi, he's credited as a painter who creates backgrounds, which wasn't really his role. And there's this kind of odd fluidity for early screen credits. For the features, they go back to Snow White. So, but nobody gets 2 credits. So that's one of the rules. And also tons of people are miscategorized. So like for art directors, Gustav Tenggren is identified as an art director. And I say, yeah, he's an art director. But then other people like Ken O'Connor are identified as an art director in screen credits. And it's like, he's more of a layout artist. I'm not sure why he's here. And so Tyrus is identified under the backgrounds section for Bambi, but his role was far larger than that
Yeah.
for Bambi. Can you talk a little bit about what his role was and how it contributed to the development and presentation of the film?
Yeah, so it's so interesting about the sort of the background artist credit, right? Because it's there, it's up on the screen in the credit roll from the original cut of the film, and I think. Once Pam's film came out and people started to rediscover Tyrus's story, there was like this instinct for the kind of defensiveness to people to say that like, oh, that's a miscrediting. That's not right. That's an inaccurate representation of the immensity of his contribution. Because what he was really doing is what John Canemaker and other Disney historians like yourself today now recognize as an inspiration sketch artist. That he's a concept artist. He's setting the tone. He's keying the vibe or the mood of the film. And so what he's doing is he's looking at the story or the script and he's creating single one-off images of the episodes that they're considering for animation, right? And so he's imagining the world of the film, he's setting their color scale, he's giving reference scenes for all of the other character animators and the special effects animators to know, oh, this is the space that the characters need to move through. This is the mood of the sequence, right? This is the world in which these special effects like the raindrops or the fire must take place. And so he's not doing any animation, right? So he's unlike in betweening, he's not actually creating any motion. And then he's not actually a physical background painter, which is what a background artist today would be, which is somebody who's actually sitting there painting these long scrolls that are going to be photographed. They're the bottom layer of the cell stack, right? He's not doing that. But what he's doing is he's making a series of images that are then going to become these sort of reference points for all of the other creatives associated with the film. So it's essentially kind of the soul of the film in a sense, right? It's that first vision or imagination to convert story idea into images. And so that's why I think now everyone recognizes how significant his contribution is and why the credit background artist seems misleading or inadequate. But as you yourself point out, I mean, credits in animation, particularly in Disney, there was, Bambi was only going to be the second feature, right? And so like they're still figuring out all of these credits and all of the roles for future animation as well. So.
Yeah, especially when they're over at the Hyperion lot. I think there's a lot more fluidity as to who's doing what and who's helping on what, and then that becomes more regimented once they move to Burbank. But I have some questions about Tyrus's work on Bambi in particular. First off, his use of light and color is stunning, and I think this tells viewers how they're supposed to emotionally engage each scene, which is like tremendously effective. But also, from what I understand about Tyrus, and I think you understand way more than I do, his personal experiences are mainly urban in San Francisco or in Central California or in LA. And for most of his life, he is painting scenes of nature off and on for the cards and for Bambi and for some of his personal work. And with Bambi in particular, the studio, he reads the book, I believe, which is set in an alpine forest in Europe, someplace he hasn't visited. And the studio sends a photographer named Jake Day to Maine to take photos of the Baxter State Forest, which are going to be reference material that inspires the environment for Bambi, which is also not a place that Tyrus had visited. So how does all of this work? Does this come out of some of the artistic traditions that he studied? Is this part of his imagination? How does this work for Tyrus to create these things that he has not personally experienced?
That's such an interesting question. I think you're the first person to ask that. So I would say you're absolutely right to sort of intuit that some of it has to do with the distinctiveness of his signature style and vision and the artistic heritage that he's influenced by. So classical Chinese painting and particularly Song Dynasty painting that Tyrus favored the most is a kind of painting style, which is kind of the antithesis again of sort of European perspectival realism. So if you're familiar with classical Chinese painting, right, on these scrolls, right, there's a lot of negative space. Like there's a flower or a bird on a branch, but often there's no sense of perspective. Things just kind of fade off in representation. There'll be so much negative space that you'll probably see more paper or silk than the ground being covered by paint, right? And of course, they're using watercolor, so it's transparent and stuff. So classical Chinese painting, and particularly of all of the periods, Song Dynasty painting is renowned for its ability to create mood or to convey an ideal or the idea of something rather than a specific thing. This is what Tyrus, admired and aspired for in his own work. I think for him, and this is what's so wonderful about his insight with Bambi was, coming off of Snow White, Walt had all of these amazing artists who were so gifted at doing this incredible sort of fairy tale enchantment. But, Tyrus sort of looks at it and realizes like, you're never going to see the animals if you're sitting there like painting every little leaf on every tree. And so he says, you need to create the feeling of the forest. You need to evoke the sense of a nature that's populated with life without actually drawing all of that life. And that's something that he knows how to do from the traditions of Chinese classical painting.
So I have another question about his work on Bambi and the style that he brings to Bambi. So one of the problems that Disney and other animation studios have in the 1930s is that for the early part of the 1930s, all the characters are seen pretty much from head to toe because they're choreographed. And so for dance matters or rhythmic movement matters.
Right.
But what's happening in live action is that they have these new, longer, low-stop lenses that allows cinematographer to keep a subject, an actor, in sharp focus while blurring the background. And Walt is trying to make his films more like live action films.
Mm-hmm.
And Tyrus's understanding of how painting works solves that problem. I'm not sure if he's aware of it or if it's just intuitive, but his softness in the backgrounds makes Bambi seem far more like the live action productions that are coming out of Warner Brothers or MGM at the time than do Pinocchio, where like everything except for the underwater sequences is in really sharp focus in the background.
Yeah.
So could you talk a little bit about how that works in the film, or if you know that Tyrus was aware that he was making this film have an aspect that related more to live action features than the previous animated features?
As a biographer, I would say that I don't want to go, I'm not sure that I would say that he's sort of already anticipating like these sort of differences with live action and like the ways in which that he's forecasting the Walt's changing vision over time, but, depth in the Western tradition, whether you're talking about perspectival painting or in sort of modern cinema, is one that's interested in depth that creates like a sort of tangible, realistic depth, right? Whereas classical Chinese painting creates depth through shadow and light and the fading of color and line, right? They don't use perspective lines, and it's often sort of frequently unrealistic. So you can have like, a boat and a mountain, and then like a mountain, like like right behind it. That makes no sense except for it looks really great type thing, And so I think Tyrus sort of like when he sort of is sitting in Disney and he in the Seward Street studios and he's hearing all these problems about Bambi, and he sort of realizes like, oh, I think this will work, is that he just realizes that you need to suspend the sort of compulsion towards realism. But yeah, I think a lot of it just has to do with like, not so much that Tyrus is sort of standing back and sort of he's staking a gamble on where he thinks animation is going to go, or where the Disney Studios is going to go. But he certainly at that moment is thinking, I really hate in-betweening, right? From what I hear, this thing that I'm already doing might actually help them, right? And I think that thing that he's doing is the way that he approaches depth, as opposed to what the Disney Studios was doing at the time, for all of the reasons that you're saying.
Yeah, it creates a lovely look and feel for the overall picture when it's done, and it makes it distinct from Dumbo, from Pinocchio, from the things that came before it.
And I think also like Tyrus, he goes to the library, he checks out the book, he reads the book, right? And he famously says when he reads a story like, gosh, all of this takes place outdoors, right? So he's sort of immediately sort of recognizing the idiom, his artistic idiom is already suited for this particular project.
Yeah. So you were talking about Seward Street. I had a question about Seward Street. Mm-hmm. So the Hyperion Studio is just overgrown. It's made to produce short animation, and with Snow White and Bambi, it quickly expands beyond that. They're
Yeah.
working out of houses and apartment buildings that they've rented or purchased. And so they have this kind of second smaller studio on Seward Street for Bambi, which is physically removed from the main campus at that time until everyone gets back together in Burbank later. Walt goes over there, but not nearly as much as he's at Hyperion.
Right.
Tyrus has an interview where he says that he's in meetings with Walt, but he's never formally introduced to him. So he
Right.
sees Walt. I mean, they're in the same space, but they don't know each other. So do you think that this separation hurt Tyrus's career at Disney? That he was over in the B studio at the time when things are going on more at Hyperion Lot?
Yeah, I mean, I think the physical separation of the Bambi artists from the Hyperion art, from the larger Hyperion operations, I think the fact that he's not white, he's got a thick accent. I mean, you can tell from the book, like he's got this great personality and he doesn't compromise. But at the same time, remember, he's an immigrant. He's still not a citizen at the time because Chinese can't become citizens. If immigrants can't become citizens until the end of exclusion, then the war happens, right? Like he's still there, right after when internment begins, right? Like he's not going to rock the boat. Well, clearly he was noting the fact that, gee, nobody's introducing me. He doesn't want to make a scene. And so I think that sort of, when the strike happens and Bambi is pretty much done, pretty much in the can, they don't need his inspiration work, which happened sort of in the early part of production. And then he had only worked on Bambi. And then his standard 3-year contract was up, right? All of those things worked against him. The fact that nobody else really knew him outside of the Bambi artists.
Bank of America is putting pressure on Disney at this time.
Yeah.
They're wildly in debt
Yeah.
to stop work on future features and also to limit expenses, which is not going to be helpful for Tyrus as well.
Yeah.
So I've got another question about Tyrus. One thing that I found curious about him. So many of the art school trained artists that come in from Otis or Chenard during this period, they've been inculcated into the system where teachers or fellow students have put this voice in, somewhere in their consciousness that they need to produce their own vision, that their own vision needs to be valued and recognized and be a representation of them out there in the world. And so many of the art school trained artists that come into Disney during this period, they have these like lifelong ambitions to be either gallery fine artists or to work in New York illustrations. Those are the two places that so many of them want to go. I can only think of like two other kind of key people that don't have those ambitions going on, and they are John Hench and Claude Coates. But Tyrus is in that group as well. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why Tyrus is so much more comfortable than the other art school trained artists around him about being in a collaborative commercial field than most of the other animators or painters he works with.
I think because he was an immigrant. He's a non-white immigrant who can't become a citizen. At that time, he doesn't know that there'll ever be a time that he can become a citizen, right? And he sort of knows that. And also, I think Otis was really great among all of the art schools at the time, like that there was a significant component of Otis where they were sort of recognizing our students are going to go on and work in industry, whether it's in the movie studios, they're going to go into commercial design or advertising, right? Like not all of these people are going to go on and become like sculptors and fine art painters. Tyrus, of course, he just knows that he doesn't have anything else to fall back on. Right. And so again, he's going to choose the thing that's in some ways like safe or reliable. And then remember, it's hard to make your way as an artist for anybody. Tyrus may have chosen, like many non-white artists at that time, to work in commercial art because it allowed them not just predictability, but also kind of anonymity that paradoxically, because you're an artist, makes you more visible. Right. If you can find a venue to get your work out, isn't that in itself a reward?
I think that was a very hard thing for many artists to get to in the 1930s and 40s. But I agree with you that they're making something that is appreciated by millions, or hundreds of millions of people, whereas the other path might have a very small audience at the end of it.
Yeah. And that's also why I always thought the Christmas cards were like part of the most interesting part of Tyrus's story, because, you can be as instrumental in Bambi and you can even have a credit, but then, how many times do people really watch credits of feature films in general, right? Whereas with the Christmas cards, his name is on every Christmas card. His artist contracts ensure that his name is on every Christmas card. He signs them. They're signed. He puts his name. Actually, he often signs them twice with his signature and his Chinese seal. And then they're often printed on the back of the cards. And then because they become so popular, people are seeking specifically his cards. And then the cards are going in homes all across the nation. Commercial art allows a scale of visibility that a fine art painting does not.
So we should probably wrap up. So in your book, you follow his whole life, not just the Disney career, but his early life, and all the way through the Christmas cards. And what I think is kind of like the rediscovery of Tyrus's work towards the end of his life with the documentary and his exhibitions. So maybe you could leave us with this. If listeners wanted to go back and watch Bambi another time, what should they notice about Tyrus's contributions to this film that they might not have picked up on in earlier viewings?
First of all, I would tell people, if you can, to watch it on film, to not watch a digital projection, because the digital projection clarifies lines that are more painterly when they're projected on film. So if you have the opportunity to see it on film, I really recommend it because it's just transporting. But I think that the beauty of his backgrounds is that, ironically, the backgrounds is so marvelous that they start to come forward. They're not simply backgrounds. And so I think for all of us who first saw Bambi as a child, like what you remember, is how cute Thumper's voice is, the trauma of what happens to Bambi's mother, and, maybe the Twitter-pated sequence or something like that. You remember the characters, you remember the gags, right? I mean, that's what animation is for us as kids. But as an adult, when you go back and you watch it, like, you really see Bambi is a work of art. The screenwriter William Goldman, I found this quote after I sent my book off to the publisher, so I'm so angry at myself. But William Goldman, the screenwriter, has this wonderful point where he talks about sort of like early in his career, like when he sort of rethinks how he became a screenwriter. He says Bambi was a film that made him realize that films are not just films, they're art. To think of every frame of Bambi, like I quote in the Hollywood Reporter, like a painting. That's what you'll look for. I think you can't not see it once you know about it.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I very much appreciate it.
I'll be back next week with a new episode. You can find Karen Fang's book on Amazon. It's called Background Artist: The Life and Work of Tyrus Wong. And if you only check this podcast feed once a week, if you go back one episode, you will find our classic Halloween episode up now for this year. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.